Welcome to Charm of the Wilderness, where we embark on a journey through the stunning landscapes of our national parks and public lands, expanding our understanding of climate justice and Indigenous justice along the way. I'm Elizabeth Dorr, your guide in exploring the rich tapestry of our national parks and public lands, discovering not only their breathtaking beauty, but also the vital lessons they hold for our planet's future, as well as the challenging history and current political context of these parks and public lands. Join me as I talk to inspiring, innovative, and driven people working in environmental justice, climate science, Indigenous education, equity in the outdoors, and more to delve into pressing environmental issues and learn how we can advocate for a more equitable and sustainable world for all. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Charm of the Wilderness. I am really excited to talk with Stephen Pyne and Tom Nichols about fire and wildfire. I have interviewed both of these guys a while back, specifically for my chapter on Yosemite National Park and how wildfire has shaped and continued to be a big part of Yosemite. And so I'm excited to bring them onto the podcast together because I talked to them separately. I talked to Stephen first, and he put me in touch with Tom, and they both helped me think about fire in a really specific and important way. And I'm excited for you all to hear from them. But first, I'll give you a quick intro. Stephen Pyne is a professor emeritus at Arizona State University, the Center of Biology and Society. He is one of the preeminent U.S. scholars on fire history and science. He wrote The Pyrocene, How We Created an Age of Fire and What Happens Next, arguing that humanity has entered a new geological epoch called the Pyrocene, defining our species' unique and transformative relationship with fire, from cooking food to burning fossil fuels, which has fundamentally altered the planet. And he also wrote Pyrocene Park about Yosemite and fire, and that's actually something that I read and used a lot when I was writing the chapter. And Tom Nichols spent his entire career working for the National Park Service. He was the chief of fire and aviation for the National Park Service from 2015 to 2014. And he worked in the National Park Service from 1977 to 2014. So he has a lot of knowledge about that agency and fire related to it. And so we'll also get into some conversations about what's happening today based on kind of our knowledge. So to just kick us off, can each of you tell me about how you got interested or into researching fire for Steve and fire management for Tom? What was your pathway and interest? Do you want to kick us off, Steve?
Sure. Well, I got interested in fire completely accidentally, serendipity at work. A few days after graduating from high school in Phoenix, I found myself on a forest fire crew at the North Rim of Grand Canyon. I was signing on as a laborer for the park, and they suddenly had an opening on the fire crew and wanted to fill it, and there I was. So I was 18. What did I know? Did I want to go over and be on a forest fire crew in a place I'd never been to? Tools I didn't know the name of, equipment sure, why not? Yeah, I did that for 15 seasons. 12 as
15 seasons. Oh, wow.
So, but that experience was always about the canyon as well as fire. And so I was going on to college and then graduate school, and I took the canyon and its discoverers, its scientists and so forth for my graduate work, and wrote a biography of Grove Gilbert, one of the members of the Powell Survey, and then later first chief geologist of USGS. But while I was doing that, I was becoming more and more interested in the other part, which was fire, because fire is what made it all possible, and became more intrigued by fire and the controversies over fire. So that's how I got into fire. So after I got my doctorate, no jobs either in fire or academically, and I spent the winter on a seasonal position on the South Rim, and then decided I would combine those two lives and write a general history of fire. Well, I thought my academic career, it took me 5 years to get an interview, and that was the last year. I thought it was through. So I was writing this book, and this was my last hurrah. So I would publish my dissertation, a biography of Gilbert. I would write a book about what it was like to be in a fire crew on the North Rim, and then I would write this big fire history, and then I didn't know what I was going to do. So until very recently, fire has had a hard time finding its place in the culture as something other than a disaster or something that requires an emergency response. And so that's been a long, hard preparation. I've been happy to do it. So,
Tom, do you want to tell us how you got into fire?
Yeah, I'm supposed to be in oceanography. I'm supposed to be studying whales. That went horribly wrong. So I went to San Diego for undergraduate. In my last quarter, I actually took a class on what to do with the Disney proposal for Mineral King, Sequoia National Park. It's supposed to be a ski resort. And at that time, it was very controversial. And we took a class on the pros and cons of conservation of that area. And when the dust settled, I actually switched from oceanography into ecology. And so I went over to San Diego State. I got a master's degree in fire ecology. I spent after that a year at UC Berkeley, where I ran into Harold Biswell, who was just coming online as introducing what he'd learned in the Southeast United States for prescribed burning to California. And so he's one of the pioneers of prescribed fire in the Park Service, both state parks and national parks in California. I met him. He gave me a job referral, and I wound up in Sequoia Kings Canyon for 15 years running the prescribed fire program. From there, I went to the regional office in San Francisco for the Park Service, and I was the fire officer for Pacific West, which is the 7 western states. I was there for about 10 years. I took 3 years down to Yosemite. I was the fire chief for Yosemite for 3 years. And then, as you mentioned, I came up here to the National Fire Center in Boise for about almost 10 years as the National Fire Chief for the Park Service. So, in a nutshell, I'm the only person I can think of who has been a fire chief or a fire management officer at the park, regional, and national levels for the Park Service, all in one career. So I've been exposed to all kinds of levels and all kinds of agencies for that period of time. So it kind of gives me a little more unique perspective about how we all got here, like Steve says, with regard to fire history, but more of an inside baseball story about what goes on with inside the politics and administration and policy development for the Park Service and its associate agencies.
Yeah, that's why I love having brought you two together, because you have kind of the inside baseball perspective, and then we have Steve to give kind of the bird's eye view perspective on it. I had a question. Actually, this is kind of for both of you, but mostly for Steve. One of the things that I found so fascinating when we talked before, and also what I've read about fire management, because we hear a lot about prescribed burns as being so important to managing fire, but they, for a century plus, the fire management history in the U.S. is really about fire suppression. And we can talk more about that. We can talk about the history of that. But what I'm really curious about is kind of this divide about fire management between, quote, the elites or those who manage policy and those from traditional cultures or communities. So you've said that this was the case in Europe, and it's still the case in Europe in a lot of places, and also in North America. I think we think of it more as, an indigenous approach to cultural burning and prescribed fire versus kind of the policymakers' approach. But it's not just indigenous perspectives of fire. So can you talk a bit about that divide and what we've come to see from that divide, or what has come out because of that divide?
Yeah, and this is an interesting question, which has taken new form recently because of cultural burning, not only in the United States but also in Canada and especially Australia, and that's tied up with indigenous issues and colonization. The real shock, the real effort to suppress fire comes when elites, particularly foresters, begin to control large amounts of public land. And this was a wide scale. This was throughout Europe's colonial empire. It was in Algeria. It was in India. It was all over the place. The U.S. story, in many ways, the U.S. debate begins at Yosemite, where you've got a divide right with the commission, half of whom liked the indigenous burning, were perfectly happy with it, but people like Olmsted and Whitney did not, and they won. And there's some interesting comments. Emil Ernst, who was a forester at Yosemite, I think in the 1860s, looked back on it all and he said it's remarkable. So many people held to a policy with which they professionally and personally disagree. How did it come to be? Well, it was partly about control, but this was general. This is true in Europe. I mean, the towards fire in colonial settings by the European officials was exactly the same they applied to Finns who were slashing and burning across the boreal forest, or Greeks running their sheep and goats in Mediterranean mountains, or peasants burning in the Black Forest of Germany. It was all considered just superstition, folklore, custom, and this is what reason with the capital R and enlightened management would eliminate and replace with more formal and validated kinds of knowledge. And in fact, the first conference I'm aware of about forestry in this setting, this sort of global conservation project, was in British India, 1878. They just passed a new law creating these forest reserves and the rest. They assembled everybody and they wrote it, they published everything. And there's a split. The first question asked at the conference, the foundational question, is fire control possible? The second question, is it desirable? And they split. And the academics, the officials, the people responsible for public order, public presentation of being colonial rulers and the rest all said, we have to control fire. That is a way of control. Setting the land aside is meaningless because it will burn. People will burn it.
And by controlling fire, you mean suppressing it?
Eliminating it. Suppressing it, but suppressing
eliminating it.
Starting, simply removing the people. And this is what we see in the U.S. as well. A lot of the missing fire is not natural fire that was suppressed. It was fires that people used to set and no longer did. So there was, then the people who are actually on the ground said, this is a crazy idea. It will mess up the landscape. The locals will hate us, which they did, and it will fail. And eventually they wind up compromising and putting in what they called early burning, sort of sub rosa. It was never officially sanctioned. It had to happen. So right from the foundation, we see this debate, and we're seeing now another avatar of it being recreated in sort of the form of cultural burning. But the real divide was, even in the U.S., was not when settlers came in, even if they moved in one way or another, the indigenous people, because they continued to burn. And in many ways fused, hybridized their burning habits, what they had, their cultural history of burning and experiences with those of the natives. The divide comes when a different category of people who are not out there managing the land themselves, but making decisions about it, decide as a matter of policy and justified by what they called good science, needed to eliminate fire. Fire was a stigma of primitivism. They're very clear about this, particularly in agriculture. If you burn, you're primitive. And the way to modernize, to be reasonable, is to eliminate open burning. So that was a very strong cultural marker and a really unfortunate one.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing that especially in the history of fire management in the U.S., if we're going to talk about that, and if you can also give kind of a very quick overview of what that is. But what it seems is these are people who don't know the land, don't know the places, don't know even really the mechanics of these forests and the agriculture, making decisions for the people who do know these places. And so could you talk a little bit about just a brief history of fire management in the U.S. and how that has affected fires and mega fires that we've come to see today?
Well, I mean, in short terms, settlement in the 19th century really unsettled a great amount of the landscape, and we had this wave of mega fires, much more lethal and damaging than what we've seen in the last few decades. And that gave rise to the U.S. to participate in what we might call state-sponsored conservation, which was a global project, by the way. It was part of what helped to justify colonial rule elsewhere. And then by about 1905, 1910, we sort of have an institutional matrix to respond to that. We spend the next 50 to 60 years trying to take out all landscape fire as much as possible. The Forest Service as providing the matrix and policy and science for it. And then we spent the next 50 to 60 years trying to put good fire back in. So and that's what it is. It was never complete. Suppression, the removal of fire was as much a transformation of industry and economy and demography, people becoming more urbanized, these kinds of things, and this transition to a fossil fuel society where we found surrogates, than it was just active suppression. And trying to put fire back in, there are a few places that have been relatively successful. For the most part, we're struggling, and I doubt that we'll ever catch up. The fires will come. The question will be how much control we have over them, over how much of the land.
Tom, this question's for you, especially as somebody who is on the ground as, doing fire management. Well, one, I'd love to hear your experience about kind of this difference between what you see on the ground and then also what policymakers say that you have to do to manage fire. And then also, like, you've mentioned the failures of the National Park Service fire management and what that looked like, especially with the loss of so many giant sequoias in the last 10 years or so. So can you tell us more a little bit about that, just what it was like being on the ground and your experience with that?
So I'll actually follow off of Steve and give you a little backstory of the Park Service fire program.
Yeah, great.
The parks in general, particularly in Sequoia and Yosemite, recognized that the Native Americans had been burning and fire was a part of the ecosystem. But the Park Service also had to follow along, especially with the Forest Service, about taking a suppression posture. And they kind of continued that until about 1963. And at that time, what we call the Leopold Report came out. It was done by Starker Leopold. It was originally a survey of wildlife questions in Yellowstone. But it turns out that Starker Leopold's roommate at Berkeley, at UC Berkeley, was Harold Biswell, who I mentioned earlier. Harold Biswell asked Starker to put something in the Leopold Report addressing fire. And so if you read the Leopold Report, it mentions that fire suppression is leading to some pretty poor conditions in mixed conifer in the Sierra and advocates putting fire back in again. It turns out that Harold had a student named Jan van Weigendonk, who became the research scientist at Yosemite, and Bruce Kilgore, who was research scientist at Sequoia Kings Canyon. And both of them went to the parks and in both places began to introduce prescribed fire into the two parks. And in the case of Bruce, particularly, introduced this idea of allowing natural fires to burn in the high country. And so that spread throughout the Park Service and other agencies as well. But the important thing about that is that we speak about a common, like a federal fire policy, but the fire policy tends to be refined by the agency itself. And so if you look at the mission of the Park Service, we're supposed to be maintaining things in a pretty much unimpaired state. And so fire is part of that condition. The suppression of all fires leads to an impaired state. And so for the Park Service particularly, since the late 60s and early 70s, they began to use, wherever they could, whether it be Hawaii volcanoes, the Everglades, Big Cypress, tallgrass prairie, wherever there might be a fire presence historically, resource managers and fire managers and superintendents began to put fire back into that park management scheme again. And so that was the vision, as Steve says. And then your question to me is actually, so how'd that work out for you on the ground?
Exactly.
And so what you found was that, particularly through about late 80s or so, many parks throughout the United States were embracing some form of prescribed burning, prescribed fire, and where possible, natural fires being allowed to burn, and particularly in the high country. The watershed year, Steve knows, was 88, when the Yellowstone fires took off, and that became kind of a political issue for that year. And we could see in the stats that after 88, a lot of parks really began to rethink this idea of letting fires burn because they might get in trouble like Yellowstone did. The other watershed year was 2000, when the Cerro Grande fire, which was originally a prescribed burn in Bandelier National Monument, also a combination of events, not just Bandelier, but a combination of events, led to Los Alamos catching fire. That led to a lot of parks rethinking prescribed burning. And so meantime, after 2000, we had the National Fire Plan set up, which injected a lot of money into the federal fire program, especially in the fuels management portion of that. And so on the one hand, we had a lot of staff and a lot of money and a lot of areas going online, but also a lot of reservations about, well, what about the smoke? What about invasive species coming in? What about escapes, political issues that might pop up? And so you had this kind of a split, with part of the Park Service embracing more fire, but some of the line officers, superintendents, beginning to rethink whether or not this is a wise decision to do. One thing that's going on right now today is that after the 88 fires in Yellowstone and the 2000 fires in Bandelier, the Secretary of Interior has put out moratoriums, as Steve knows, that basically the prescribed fire use programs were shut down, a policy was reviewed, and fire management plans were revised and improved to hopefully mitigate that happening again. What's happening today, and we're going to talk about Dragon Bravo here pretty quick, the Grand Canyon fire, is I'm seeing parks that are actually operating as if there were a moratorium. In other words, full suppression again, but I can't find any written moratorium coming out. So somewhere in there, this goes back to my comment about folks are a little bit gun shy about the use of fire, times being what they are. And so now we're at a point where we probably, because of climate change and the effects of fire suppression over the years, we probably need, as Steve was saying, more prescribed fire, more fire use, the effects of climate change and these larger and larger wildfires. And yet we seem to see more of a reluctance to that.
Let me add a sidebar on the National Park Service, because twice that agency has led federal fire advances. And the first was in 1886 when the cavalry took over the administration of Yellowstone National Park. And then 1890, it came into the Sierra parks. And it was the beginning of a kind of paramilitary approach to fire, treating it as form. And interestingly, in the Sierras, the military was split. I mean, half the officers running it thought, okay, we've got our orders, we'll put fire out. The other half thought this is crazy. So it was, and the second is when, as Tom points out, with the Leopold Report in 63, codified in a new management manuals in 68, essentially for the Park Service, and then Forest Service follows 10 years later. So twice it done, and I'm hopeful the Park Service could do it again, but I'm not putting any money on that. Just yet.
Well, and one of the things that you had said to me, Tom, in a previous conversation was that you were talking about managers being a little bit gun shy because there's a really small gap between when you can do prescribed fires and that, the weather conditions have to be right. It can't be too dry. And so then it becomes a situation of kicking the can down the road before you can do it. And then now you haven't done prescribed fire and it's just getting worse year to year. I don't know if you maybe can expand upon that a little bit, because it's a tricky situation to be put into to make these decisions to actually carry out the prescribed burning.
So I'll go back to 63 again in Sequoia Kings. In 1965 and 66, 67, a group of researchers from San Jose State, the Richard Hardesfelt group, came in to study the role of fire in giant sequoias in the parks. And they found two main findings. One was that fire suppression did not give you the conditions for germination of young sequoias. And so if you wanted young sequoias, you better have some prescribed fire in there to help germinate the seeds. The other issue was that they documented an extreme buildup of fuels. That in fire suppression, you basically had wood coming down and it wasn't being burned up by anything. It simply kept compounding over time. And so they identified you want to have anything like an unimpaired, like Park Service policy, giant sequoia grove, you have to have some kind of fire in there, like a prescribed fire. And if you don't, you have impaired giant sequoias, and you also have wildfire risk of giant sequoias. So that's 1966, 7, 8, somewhere in there. So you flash forward to 2021, when the KMP complex burned through the same area, the mountain, and it killed about 25% of the giant sequoias. Now, the last time you and I talked, I called that one of the greatest resource management disasters to the Park Service. And I say that because if you do the math, you have between 1968 and 2021 to basically prescribe, burn, and reduce the fuels and wildfire risk in about 2,000 acres of giant sequoia groves in Red Mountain. Did it happen? For part of the mountain, yes, and that actually survived the wildfire. For the lower third of the mountain, and it was never done for a variety of reasons. And I was part of that program, so I'm not just pointing fingers, but that was my program too. And so, the third of the mountain, which in over 50 years did not get treated, burned severely, and that's where those giant sequoias came from. So the issue there is that the knowledge of wildfire risk has been going on since the late 60s. The policy's been in place, the money's been in place in many cases, and so you wind up with on the ground, and this is what you're asking me about, what my experience is, because having worked at the park, the regional, the national level, I understand the role of people, park managers, individual personalities, their comfort or lack of comfort with the use of fire impede or advance the use of fire to mitigate wildfire risk in the park. So we're going back to Yosemite today, as we speak, the superintendent of Yosemite has ordered a moratorium, essentially, a full suppression posture towards natural fires in Yosemite. He did it last year too. The crews go out there and they put it out. Now that program has been in place since 1972. Thousands of acres have been burned naturally in the high country, prescribed fire in the low country. And if I put on my political hat, I can see that there's issues going on up and down the Park Service who are making folks worried about the use of fire, especially after Dragon Bravo and Grand Canyon. A lot of folks will tell me that they couldn't do prescribed burning because of lack of money, lack of people, lack of whatever's. But I always thought that somewhere in there, it's like there's two kinds of people. There's people who want to do prescribed burn and can find reasons to do it. And there's folks who don't want to do prescribed burns and can find a reason to do it. And if you see this, as Steve was mentioning, the movement of folks who can do to those folks who won't, you can have all the policy you want in the world, which is pro-fire, but getting her done in the course of the last 50 years is something else.
It's pretty hard. Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Dragon Bravo fire in the Grand Canyon. Steve, last we talked, it was before that happened. And I know that the Grand Canyon is very significant to you personally. So what did the loss mean to you personally, and loss especially of the Grand Canyon Lodge, and what do you know, and this is maybe a question to both of you, about the fire and what happened there now that are a few months past that?
Well, personally, I was distraught. How could I not be? It wasn't just the lodge. It was essentially the entire developed area. The places that I had lived in as a seasonal, the unit manager's house where I was married, in a freak snowstorm, we had to move in from the rim. Administrative office where we had our reception, that's gone. All that, all that stuff. Most of it built back in CCC days. So I was fortunate in a way that a year before Dragon Bravo, my oldest daughter, who spent her first 2 summers on the North Rim, arranged for her family to meet my wife and me and stay at the lodge. So we all went up there and had a kind of reunion and had a good time. And I took my granddaughter around and showed her all the stuff. So we took photos. So I sort of, in a sense, had a kind of closure. I'd gone back now, and so the next year it's all wiped out. But it was not as devastating as it might have been because I just had a refresher and had good memories. So that's what I carried away from. As to Dragon Bravo, I don't know what's going on with that. The park, I'm writing a book on it. I want to create the larger context. I want to look at the whole Kaibab plateau and see how this fire, in many ways, it was a capstone fire. It every kind of fire you can have on the plateau, you had. It burned in the canyon, it burned out to canyon mesas, it burned the developed area, it burned, reburned places. I mean, everything. Add it all up, and practically every strategy of managing fire that you could apply was applied, and they all failed. The fire eventually went out because it ran out of stuff to burn. I have been waiting. I've been holding my fire on this, waiting for the mandated review, which I understand is still creeping along. They're still interviewing people who were there. Nobody's in a hurry to revive that memory. I don't know what's going on. So
is that atypical, this timeline of the review?
Well, usually it goes on pretty briskly. People want to put it behind them, move on. In this case, I just had the sense they just wanted it to go away somehow. They could run out the clock. I don't know. I really don't. There are a lot of, personally, I don't keep the fire. I'm not angry at the Park Service. I think there were a lot of questions, one of which is in the Southwest. Every large fire, every blow-up fire occurs in the run-up to the monsoon. And the monsoon was late. It was a month late. I mean, they're already in water shortage restrictions at the lodge. People are evacuating because of another fire north of the park, which was fortunate because it got people out before Dragon Bravo swept in. I really don't know. And I've decided not to try to second guess at this point. I'll wait for the review, but I'm not sure they're going to be a review.
The unique thing about Dragon Bravo, as Steve just said, is that they may be interviewing folks, but there certainly doesn't seem to be the urgency you saw with Yellowstone or Cerro Grande or other major fire events, that you kind of get this thing kicked out so you can actually move on with the program. I suspect that what's going on in Dragon Bravo, they're trying to figure out, as Steve mentioned, basically you have a fire start, you have daily decisions, what to do with the fire, what you can employ for strategies, and then go after it hard with full suppression or back off to a ridge or edge of the canyon, let it be contained to natural barriers or confined. And so who decided to do what when? Who's making a decision every day on that fire? And I think until we actually see the sequence of events of who decided what to do when and where, it's going to be hard to really figure out what to do to improve the planning process for future fires. Now, I will say, can I talk about the fire service now?
Yes, please do.
That's actually going to go into what he's waiting for. I have many friends who have been advocating for years for wildland fire service. The advocacy for that is oftentimes, not entirely, but oftentimes has come from frustration with managers who, I won't call it second guessing, but if a park fire officer wants to do, say, a prescribed burn or allow fire to burn, they can take it to the superintendent and he or she might say, good idea. And I've had superintendents who have almost been offended. You put the fire out. They were so pro-fire, they wanted that fire to burn. I've had others who were gun shy about it. And so you do have a frustration within the fire community about this is what they're recommending, this is what's being approved. And so I suspect that one of the selling points for the new Wildland Fire Service, which is about 2 weeks old, basically, it came out of an executive order that was signed earlier this year, or last year, but it was actually set up in the last couple of weeks. And I think the thinking is that you would then have a Wildland Fire Service, which you take at this point, the 4 interior fire agencies, Park Service, BLM, BIA, Fish and Wildlife, and put them into one fire service. Those fire folks who are being moved right now do not report to the superintendent, do not report to the agency at all. The Wildland Fire Service, as I understand it, reports to the Secretary of the Interior. So all those employees are now basically DOI employees. And now what I'm waiting to see is what happens when a park superintendent would rather not see a fire allowed to burn or a large prescribed burn being done, but the Wildland Fire Service says, we think we should do that. Now, at this point, you might say working for the secretary outranks working for the superintendent. So folks ask me, there are pros and cons about this. One of the pros might be, in fact, that you have a more streamlined, consolidated fire organization. But you also, working for the department, may wind up having a much more political organization. Mm-hmm. And so I can actually see, and I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I can definitely see if you have an election year, and all of a sudden it's not the Park Service that owns that fire if it gets away, mm-hmm. it's the department who works for the president. If that fire gets away, you might be going to see more of an expansion contraction. On the one hand, the Wildland Fire Service will have hard targets for fuels treatment acreage, and they're going to be under pressure to make that happen. Mm-hmm. But you also have the reality of whether or not, if something goes wrong, who's going to be holding the fuzzy end of the lollipop for that one. And I would say this first year, they're busy just getting the thing stood up structurally. I wouldn't be surprised if this year they tell the Wildland Fire Service firefighters to take it easy on letting fires burn the high country again, which would make sense in this first year trying things out. But second year, third year, fourth year, perhaps, will we actually see, will the target acres be completed? Will the program be more efficient? Will you actually see a reduction in suppression costs? Will you see better firefighter safety? Will you see more acres treated for either resource purposes, or have like wildlife refuges, or giant sequoia habitat, or for hazard reduction? So my point to actually Steve and anybody listening would be, give it about 2 or 3 years. Let's see if the benefits that have been touted that would accrue from this are actually happening. The con in this, and what I fear is going to happen, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but you wind up with basically everybody's wearing the same white fire shirt with brass on their collars, like you see in city fire departments, and you have basically a suppression organization. And if that happens, if basically the lowest common denominator is suppression, then you can say goodbye to those use of fire in the high country for wilderness management, and be careful of what they tout as fuels targets, or the percentage of fuels targets accomplished. Because if the fire management plan says we need to be prescribed burning 5,000 acres a year to mitigate climate change effects, suppression effects, restore natural conditions, and they've hoisted up a target of 100 acres, and they met it.
I am really curious because when a big mega fire happens, everyone knows about it. And also people states away from it know about it from the smoke. And so I can absolutely see suppression as a political move in, an election year. But also, like you said, like they could set a really low bar for prescribed fire that might you meet your goals, but does that actually meet the larger goal of mitigating mega fires? So I guess time will tell. I guess, is that the answer?
Well, yeah, Tom did an excellent job laying out, I thought, the pros and cons. Let me reframe it a little bit in that we have examples of it working and not working, having a consolidated fire service. And one place where it works is Alaska. The Alaska Fire Service could in some ways be a model, except that essentially land use among all the agencies is the same. So their names are different, they're slightly different, but their need, what they want to do for fire management is the same. So a common service can do that. Plus the logistic expenses in Alaska are so astronomical. But we've also got a negative example, which is 50 years from, say, 1910 to the 1960s of the Forest Service being a single hegemon. In fact, it controlled everything. It controlled research. It controlled all the crews. It controlled the aircraft. It set policy. It directed all the science. We had one agency, and what happened with the reforms in the 60s, putting fire back, they were putting fire back because the land needed it. They had different agency objectives. They had different charters. And all the agencies, federal agencies, got new charters during the 60s and 70s. They all needed their own fire program to meet the needs of their mission. So there's a division, there are ways to cooperate when necessary. So that broke apart for those reasons. The question now is, are we creating a new Forest Service on this? Or I would say, to my mind, potentially even worse, a kind of national CAL FIRE, or given the way in which burning cities is being used to justify major reforms, which has nothing to do with wildlands, by the way, that's being done that in effect, we're going to create an urban style fire service out in the woods. And we're not going to do a totally different culture. It's going to be divorced from land. And I would also point out that apart from the political liabilities and advantages, we also have a fairly strenuous fire industrial complex now. There's a lot of privatization that's gone on. There's a lot of favoring suppression. There is not a lot of money favoring fire restoration. So unless something is prepared to fight back against those pressures, what we will do is to go back to a kind of what we had for 50 years in the early 20th century, which failed. And in fact, it's failed everywhere it's been applied. But in the short term, it can be effective. We're saving you. And there have got to be ways to fight back on that, beginning with separating the urban fire conflagration, wildland management. When right now, what in justifying the program, the new service, we're seeing them merged so that you get the public alarm and concern, but then you're not necessarily addressing that. Anyway, Tom, I'm sure has some thoughts on this.
I think Steve's exactly right, because when you go back to the 60s, the people who drove the transition from fire control to fire management wasn't just the fire staffs. It actually was the resource staffs and the science staffs who advocated for the whatever your mission might be, whether you're the BLM or the Park Service, that the fire program had to serve those resource needs, like giant sequoias. And so, as Steve was just saying, if you consolidate the program into one service, the question of whether or not that service is responsive and sensitive to those science and resource issues that each agency carries with them. And as Steve just mentioned, the pushback factor, what I'm not sure I'm going to see, but I hope I do, will be will the resource managers of the Park Service or Fish and Wildlife or anybody else say, hey, what happened to my prescribed fire program on the refuge?
I mean, I think this my last question is kind of, we'll see what happens with this new fire service, but what would you like to see moving forward with fire management? This question is for both of you. And I guess the question is, do you think it's too late in the face of climate change to make notable changes? Or what do you think is kind of the prognosis at this point?
So and well, Steve had maybe the last word here, but every park, this is the Park Service program, so I'm talking about the Park Service specifically. So every park has a fire management plan. Every park is laid out with environmental compliance documents and a planning document, what they would expect to see done, scope, scale, location, timing, duration, effects of the use of fire in that unit. So if you want to protect giant sequoias, you need to burn a certain number of acres every year to make that happen. So if they would simply, whether it's done by an agency-specific fire program or an interior level fire program, as long as somebody's program manages to realize the vision that those planning documents have in them, that would be a success. And as Steve mentioned, you were going back 60, 70 years, you keep reaching for that to happen. And for one reason or another, it never seems to quite get there in many areas. So if we can simply do what we said we're going to do for the last 60 or 70 years, let's go do it. And we kind of know why it hasn't happened. And I think that if we can get there, I think with regard to your question about climate change, I mean, wildfires are getting bigger. I think in the last 20 years, every Western state has had its largest wildfire.
Yep.
That might be caused by climate change. It might be caused by a buildup of fuels because of fire suppression. It might be caused because there's a lot more buildings now in the urban interface to protect. A lot of factors there. But in the end, I think if you go back to those giant sequoia groves in Sequoia, Kings Canyon, Yosemite, you just do what you say you're going to do. Protect them from wildfire. And if you can protect them from wildfire, you go a long way to protect them from climate change as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Steve, what are your thoughts?
I go back to default fire triangles, and my fire triangle for the future is we have too much bad fire, too little good fire, and too much combustion. And the bad fire, pretty self-evident. The good fire, how to get the right fire for the land. difficult cultural, political issues involved, lots of stuff. And then climate change, this whole transition to fossil fuels of sort. I think we need to address all of those at the same time. But I think one of the foundation moves has to be to separate out urban conflagrations from the wildland scene. And in this case, I don't want fire services merged. We've seen that in California, and when the urban always wins. And I want the culture of wildland fire. I want that kind of management to occur. Yeah, I'm looking out my window at the Tano National Forest, a mega fire 3 years in a row. The last one was really nasty. It was finally stopped by two other fires. One was a wildfire. The other was on Pinal Mountain, where 4 years earlier they had managed a wildfire and they had done all the background work and the rest of it, and they had burned that area out, not as an emergency backfire, but as a kind of what I think of as a prescribed fire done under urgent conditions. And they worked with that fire. They ended up calling in a type 1 team to manage it. It was getting more complicated. They pulled it off. They saved the town behind it, Globe, from being encroached. Okay, so the Telegraph fire in 2021 is stopped by the Mescal fire, another wildfire on one side. Its main rush over Pinal Mountain, it went to ground when it hit that managed wildfire. And to my mind, that's the future. These fires are going to happen, and they will either be stopped by other wildfires or by whatever steps we take to get some measure of good fire back in and build some resilience. And the longer we hold off on that, which is the problem with, well, this, we want to get fire, but not this year. It's not the right year. The politics isn't right. Well, the weather is squirrely. Not this year. There's always a reason to stop. And unless we do it, it's just going to happen on its own. And then the problem will be not trying to prevent or get ahead. It may be too late, but how do we burn back better out of these large mega fire burn footprints? The mix of anyways, the thing to do, you should be in there the next year. You got a lot of black, you got a lot to play with. You should be engaged with that. And I don't see that kind of thing happening. But I have to, because if you don't think anything can be done, you do nothing. And I've got grandkids. Much to my shock, I have great grandkids now, and I think we have a pretty worn out, shop worn, afraid, and we can do better. They deserve better. So yeah, we all do what we can with the gifts we have, and you wonder sometimes whether it really makes a difference or not. But you have to try.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe a question to leave our listeners with is also, how can we as visitors to these wild spaces, to national parks, also participate in kind of this re-education around fire too, and re-educating ourselves around fire? I think one of the concerns I know a lot of times is not just like, will this fire get out of hand, but how will this affect the visitors to the national park? So speaking of Yosemite, the Yosemite Valley, which is the most visited part of the park, is also kind of like a tunnel for the smoke. And so in a lot of ways, it is going to require visitors to kind of have to put up with smoke and to really understand what is the source of this smoke. Is it a good fire or a bad fire? But also to understand that it's for the larger benefit. And also, one thing we talked about, Steve, when we first talked, this is before I visited Yosemite in June, what to look for is in a healthy forest. I think I had grown up thinking a healthy forest was like what is actually a super overgrown, fuel heavy forest. And so I think there's a lot that we can do as visitors to national parks to just really kind of unlearn or like change our relationship with fire in a lot of ways. Yes, there's fire, but it's not all bad fire, and we need fire in order for these forests to survive and for our climate to not go too far past the threshold.
I have actually one last closing comment, but there is one thing that's happened that is new, that when Steve and I first started, much of the research and the prognostication was that if we don't do prescribed burning, for example, we're going to have mega fires, intense fires, dead giant sequoias. And so flip forward to now, well, that actually happened.
Yeah.
And major fires in Yosemite, major fires Santa Monica National Recreation, Whiskeytown, Lava Beds, Lassen, they've all had major fires. Even desert parks have had major fires. So just from an interpretive standpoint, we're not talking about what might happen. We're talking about what did happen. And what did happen is going to happen again unless you do put up with that smoke, whatever the effects you were concerned that kind of mitigated getting the burns done in the first place. We at least have that to use now. What happens when you don't do the fuel fire use programs? Well, you get all of Santa Monica burning up. Now, whether or not prescribed burning would have helped Santa Monica or not, open question. But, if you don't like the effects of prescribed fire, how about the effects of wildfire? You at least got something to compare them against right now and go forward from there in terms of building a case for future fire use.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think the giant sequoias are a perfect example too, because these are trees that thrive off of fire, of good fire. But the fires have gotten so large and hot and out of control that that they have been destroyed. That 25% of the giant sequoias are gone now because of it. And so it is that clear example of how we need fire and also how it can get out of hand. And like you said, it has happened. So
well, there's no clearer example, I think, of climate change than that, which is that those giant sequoias that are dead are 3,000 years old. So they managed to survive for 2,000 or 3,000 years with fire, and this one killed it. So what changed?
Yeah, I think I think the public is receptive. They're always blowhards and loudmouths who just want to make noise and cause a scene. But they are receptive if they understand that their property, lives, and livelihood are being taken into account. And that's why I think we need to separate these communities and their protection, which is an urban fire problem, from the wildland scene. And then on wildlands, managing fires, I really like the box and burn strategy for fire use because it puts a perimeter, it puts a boundary on it. This is how far it's going to be. This is how long we expect the smoke to be a problem. It's not, well, whatever nature will judge it. So that's my preference. But I think we have some interesting times ahead of us, I'm sorry to say. Right now, I'm happy with boring. I'm happy for a boring few years and predictable years. I mean, all of the climate change forecasts, they're all coming sooner and faster than at a higher rate than predicted. And at some point, it does start feeding back on itself.
Yeah. Yeah, but there's still hope. Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. This has been wonderful and enlightening, and I'm excited for my audience to hear it. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to post an update on some fire management stuff. This is specifically related to the Forest Service, which there was an announcement at the end of March that the administration wants to make a bunch of changes to the Forest Service, which leaves a lot of questions. Most assessments of it are that there is no reason for any of this. And my personal assessment is that it's probably just to mess things up as a way to get rid of the Forest Service in general. However, the changes that are being proposed are to move the headquarters from Washington, D.C. to Salt Lake City, Utah. And the seemingly logical change to really move things closer to the West, where the majority of wildfire in the U.S. occurs, and also moving from a regional management to state management. So having states run their own Forest Service. It sounds logical, but the change and the shakeup is going to be a real challenge. I think just a lot of staff are going to leave. They don't want to move. There's going to be a huge shakeup. But then also They are closing over 50 research offices that do research on fire management, on other types of forestry questions. And that, I think, seems to be a big part of the move on the administration that they want to get rid of. So they don't like science. Because it tells them things that they don't want to hear. And that's my personal viewpoint. And that is going to be the scariest part of it, I think. And we still don't know what this means for wildfires and wildfire management. And the only thing that I can predict is that it'll probably be not great for management, even if it's just bad communication because of the shakeup. I don't know what else is to come about that. And I'm recording this update on April 27th. And so we're yet to see what the fire season has to come. And so I'm sure I'll update on this page or on Cramming for the Apocalypse. So we will see. And I will also include a link to a story in Marketplace, which was a really great short and concise assessment of what's happening and what we might see from this change. So thanks so much for listening. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Charm of the Wilderness. I hope you felt inspired to appreciate the richness of our public lands and national parks and the vital role they play in the climate justice movement. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. You can also receive these episodes right in your inbox by subscribing to Charm of the Wilderness on Substack. Together, we can raise awareness and foster a deeper connection with nature and each other. Until next time, keep exploring the wild charm around you, and remember, every little action counts in the fight for our planet. Stay curious and connected.